Good evening and welcome to A Slice of Life. I'm your host, Jim Therian. There are between about 16, 17, or 19 different species of sparrows living in Connecticut, either living in or passing through on migration. And most of them are presumably doing pretty well. Tonight we're going to be talking about one species of sparrow in particular. I have with me, my guest tonight is a Professor Chris Elphick. He's currently researching the Saltmarsh sparrow, and he's here to tell us what's going on with the Saltmarsh sparrow. Professor Elphick, welcome to A Slice of Life.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Before we get started on the Saltmarsh sparrow, could you give us like a brief verbal resume of where you went to school and how you wound up here in Connecticut?
Sure. So I grew up in the north of England, in a small village in the northwest of England. Did my undergraduate degree at the University of East Anglia, which is on the east coast of England. I spent a year of that degree at UC Irvine, where I spent most of that year doing research on birds. And then after I finished my undergrad, I came back to the US, did a PhD at the University of Nevada, Reno, where I studied birds in rice fields in California. And then in the late 1990s, I moved to Connecticut and have been associated with the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UConn ever since.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, welcome to Connecticut.
It's been a while, but
it might
thank
be
you.
a little late. Before we get into the gist of the Saltmarsh sparrow study and your work there, I'd like to go to the split screen where we could compare, and this is primarily for the birders in the audience. I'd like to compare the house sparrow's beak with the Saltmarsh sparrow's beak. Could we bring that up? Oh, there we go.
Sure.
So on the left is the Saltmarsh sparrow, and on the right is the house sparrow. And their beak structures are rather different, I would say.
Yeah, well, house sparrows are a bigger bird, a bulkier bird, and they have a bigger, more conical beak, as you can see here. The Saltmarsh sparrows are a completely different group of birds. They're not closely related at all to house sparrow. They're very, very different. In fact, the house sparrow is a European bird that was brought over to the U.S. and has become pretty widespread, particularly in urban areas.
I would say, yeah.
The Saltmarsh sparrow is in a group that in Europe we would call buntings, but here they're mostly called sparrows. And they have kind of a longer beak. This is a young bird. Its beak is not as long as the adults. They're a little bit longer, more pointed. And you can see they look very different in terms of their plumage and other aspects as well.
Yeah. I would say, is their food source primarily different?
In a sense, I mean, they eat different types of things specifically, but both species and a lot of songbirds eat a mixture of insects and seeds. These are both seed eaters during the winter and the non-breeding season, but during the summer they will both switch over to eating insects.
Okay. Let's start talking about the Saltmarsh sparrow.
Sure.
What have you found in your research, and how long have you been doing the research?
Well, we started studying them in 2002, a long time ago. And we've been doing a lot of different types of research, both studying their biology and how they live their lives, and increasingly focusing more on their conservation and how their populations are changing. It turns out they're declining very rapidly, so we've been trying to understand why that is and what we can do about it.
Okay. If we could pull up the range map to see just about where this bird lives. Kind of a narrow range, I would say.
Yeah, and you know, this map kind of exaggerates it. It's such a narrow strip that you wouldn't be able to see it on this map if you kind of mapped it in real space. But they occur entirely within the United States. One of relatively few birds that are found only, or for which the entire range is within the United States. They're migratory, so they breed up in the Northeast from kind of central Maine down through to Virginia. And then, as you said at the beginning, they're migratory. They move south. Right around this time of year, they'll be leaving the marshes of the Northeast and are found in the southeastern United States, primarily from the Carolinas down to Florida, but some linger as far north as New Jersey, and very occasionally a few might linger here in New England.
Now, as they migrate south, are they completely dependent on marshes and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. They're only found in salt marshes, so not just any old marsh, but the marshes you find right along the coast, and that's why their range is so narrow and so restricted.
Now, I had another map, and I guess I didn't submit it, but it's basically a pencil line. And
Exactly.
like you said, these ranges are extremely exaggerated. And when you go to the Cornell site, you have to expand the map with your fingers just to see it. It's virtually a pencil line.
Yeah. I mean, it's literally just, less than a mile wide in most places.
Absolutely, yeah. Excuse me. That's got to be fairly limiting in its ability to expand, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, it really constrains where they can live, and in fact, it's even more limiting than that, because for them to be able to nest successfully, they're limited to just a portion of that marsh, so they can only nest at the very highest elevations within those marshes.
Yeah.
Because the lower elevations get flooded every day, and so the nest would get flooded if they were nesting there.
Can the sparrows nest in like upland rivers, or is it just right on the coast?
They might extend a very short distance up the river, the bigger river systems, but they only nest in the grasses that grow in salty conditions. So if it ceases to be salt water, then you won't find them.
Wow. Now, several years ago, I was involved in the Connecticut Atlas, as I know you were as well. And I would go to the marsh several times, and one time, only one time, I saw what I thought was a Saltmarsh sparrow. And about 2 seconds later, he zipped into the grasses and disappeared, and I never saw him again.
And they do that.
I did mark it as a Saltmarsh sparrow, but I wish I could have got a better view of him. Narrowed, okay, so that's, let's go to the challenges the Saltmarsh sparrow has of nesting. Let's go to photo 5, please. Oh, that's the other. That's the other map with a pencil line there. There we go. On another map that I had, it said peak to peak was like their whole nesting period was 26 days. Is that about average for sparrows, or is that accelerated, or?
It's pretty typical. I mean, it's some aspects of it are a little bit narrower than for some other species, but it's not too unusual. But for this species, it's really crucial, because they have to, because they're in these marshes that are tidal, so the high tide is going up and down every day.
Right.
But it also, the height of those highest tides varies across the month.
Right.
And that's linked to the lunar cycle, which I guess you can see in this image here. And so when you have a full moon or a new moon, you have higher high tides than in between. And so the challenge these birds face is that on those really high tides, the water will flood much of the marsh, and so wherever they put their nest, it's going to be vulnerable.
Right.
And if it gets flooded, there's a chance that the eggs will float out, or if there's young in the nest, that they'll drown.
Wow.
So they have to time their reproduction so that the nesting cycle fits between those really high tides, and that is typically this window of about 26, 27 days.
Wow. Now, I know some birds navigate by the sun and the moon and the stars. Do they actually start when there's a new moon or a full moon? That's when they actually start nesting?
They do, but we don't think it's because they're looking up at the moon and figuring out what time of the month it is. We think that what happens, and we have quite a lot of evidence for this at this point, is that they'll come in and they'll start nesting on those really high tides around the new moon or the full moon. The nest will all get flooded, and then they re-nest very quickly, so that failure kind of synchronizes them all. So it's not quite as clever as it.
Oh,
as it
okay. I thought, they'd look up and they say, "Oh, full moon, I got to."
Maybe, but we don't think so.
But we're not probably sure. Okay. This is amazing to me that they have to successful. They have to get it all done and fledge the chicks before the next full moon. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, and the other thing, all that work is being done by the females. The females do all of the nest building, all of the parental care.
Wow.
The males have nothing to do with it. And so that adds to the challenge. She's doing all of the searching for food to bring food to the young during the egg phase. She's the one who's sitting on the eggs the whole time, just leaving occasionally to go feed for herself.
Now, I'm wondering how that came to pass, that the male does nothing. I mean, progression over time. How come the male gets away with just there are showing up and smiling, and that's it?
There are a fair number of birds in which that's the case, and other organisms too. There are a few cases where it's switched, and the males do much of the parental care,
right,
and the females don't. But in general, it's the females. Or if you have a system where just one parent is doing the work, it's usually the females.
So apparently, this system has worked for millennia after millennia, and I guess she's a wonderful mother and she does a good job.
Well, and one of the places where this tends to arise is when you have an ecosystem with a lot of food, so it's possible for one parent to do all of the work.
Oh, okay.
In other settings, it often takes two parents to be bringing in enough food.
Right.
Salt marshes, they're very productive ecosystems. They have a lot of food being produced as a result of that, a lot of insects and spiders and other invertebrates. And so it's possible for one parent to do all the work.
Would they eat, because sometimes when the low tide is in and you walk up to the edge of the marsh or the edge of the water, you'll see all these crabs scurrying away. Mm-hmm. Do they eat the crabs, or?
I don't think so.
That's kind of big.
I mean, they're certainly not an adult one, certainly not the ones you see scurrying, maybe the very young ones. We do have a little bit of evidence that seaside sparrow, which is another species that occurs in these marshes, might eat some crustaceans, not necessarily crabs, but closely related.
So here we have on the screen another version of the same concept, flooding, high risk, egg laying, incubation. And it's still really amazing to me that the female does everything, and the male does almost nothing.
And that's correct.
All right. So in my research, I was able to find out that you actually did a paper back in many years ago. This paper here.
See which one that is. Yeah.
With Christopher Field, and. It's not a happy story.
No, it's not a happy story.
No, it's not. But I'd like to get into the three findings, or the three management options that you discovered or found out during your research. The first one would be the tidal gates. Mm-hmm. Tell us about the tidal gates.
So these are not things that we came up with. These are methods that people have used to manage marshes in a variety of different ways. Tide gates have been around for a long time. Many of the marshes in Connecticut have tide gates associated with them. But they tend to be used to, the function of a tide gate is to control the tidal flow into the upper reaches of the marsh. So oftentimes if you have a road that crosses over the marsh, there'll be a tide gate underneath it that controls that flow of water. And so they're used to basically manage flood control, among other things. In marshes, what they can do is that they can kind of dampen down the most extreme tides, so that on a really big tide, there's a limit to how much water moves into that upper reaches of the marsh.
Now, on a really big tide, is there some overflow, or does it block the whole tidal pop pressure?
On a really big tide, it could overflow, but the idea is to limit that flow.
Yeah. And who decides that this area here needs a tidal
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, often they're put in
tidal gate
to help, limit flooding of, properties around the edge of a marsh. They're used in other places. If the water would be flowing into agricultural areas, they're used in those settings as well.
Right.
So it's often being controlled by some municipality or other local agency. Of course, all of that is kind of completely independent of the birds.
Right.
But the fact that you can use a tide gate to control the amount of flooding means that you could potentially also use them to limit the most extreme high tides, which would reduce the risk of flooding out those nests.
Now, would these tide gates be installed in like a bridge, or can you just have one set there all by itself?
It's usually in a situation where you have some kind of infrastructure crossing a marsh, like a road or
Yep.
the Amtrak line or something of that nature, and then you would have a culvert or some kind of an opening so the water can flow in and out underneath that
Right.
that road or that bridge, and the tide gate would be set within that.
Okay, and it kind of sounds expensive. Is it tough to do?
I mean, I'm not an engineer. I mean,
Right.
that's kind of outside of my area of expertise. But yeah, I mean, it costs money to put in that kind of infrastructure.
Well, I apologize for doing that. Well, I was just curious.
No. It's a good question. I mean, all of these solutions are expensive, but they serve multiple functions. They also provide flood control for
Right.
properties upstream, and that's why most of them exist. And the other way to think about it is, what are the alternatives? If you didn't have it, what would be the cost of that?
Right.
And so often those costs might be more extreme than the cost of putting in the tide gate. But yeah, none of this stuff is cheap.
Well, thank you.
Which is true for life in general, I guess.
There you go. Right. All right. So, could I go look at a tidal gate? Where would I find one?
You certainly could. I'm trying to think where would be a good place. There's one on the Hammock River, not far from here.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't know the name of the road, but
Well, that's okay.
yeah.
Now, the second option is a thin layer deposition. Mm-hmm. How would that work?
So a simpler way to talk about it is to just call it, sediment addition. So the idea, the problem that the birds face is that they live in these marshes and they've got this risk of tidal flooding, but with sea level rise, the height of those high tides is getting higher. And the marshes are not raising their elevation at the same rate that sea level rise
Right.
is happening. So marshes can build their elevation, but it's not happening fast enough to keep up with sea level rise.
Okay.
So one idea that people have proposed and in a number of places are using is to add sediment to the marsh to kind of speed up the rate that it builds its elevation,
Right.
to kind of match that pace of the sea level rise. So this is used on the Gulf Coast, in areas around Louisiana where the marshes are disappearing and where there's a lot of concerns because those marshes protect a lot of human infrastructure that's kind of inland from them. And so increasingly people are thinking about using these sediment additions in the Northeast. There's a number of places where they've been done, and there are an increasing number of places where people are proposing them.
And is that an effective method for the Saltmarsh sparrow?
Well, we don't really know. It's a relatively new approach to managing marshes. It takes time to see what the effects are. We've been studying many of the marshes where people are doing it, and it seems to be helpful, but we're still kind of in the early days of trying to understand that.
Now, the sediment, is it just dredged up sand from the harbor, or what exactly is it?
It's a variety of things that people use, but it can be kind of sand or silt or essentially just mud. One of the potentially best sources is, as you say, dredged silt out of the harbors,
Right.
because that's usually close to the marshes, so you don't have to transport it very far. Often the people doing that dredging need somewhere to put all that stuff, and if
Right.
you can put it on a marsh, it can solve that problem. So it is a potentially good source as long as it's clean. Unfortunately, many of our rivers, the silt is not clean, and it has heavy metals in it, and so that would not be a good choice. But if it's clean and if it can be moved, then it's potentially a way to kind of help solve two problems, if you like.
Right. Now, how thick would that layer be?
Well, it varies. In some cases, people are putting just a few inches. In other cases,
so this is actually being done in places.
Oh yeah, it's being done. There's 2 or 3 sites in Rhode Island where there are projects that are a few years old now. There's a site in Stratford, Connecticut, where it has been used. I guess 2 winters ago, there were sediment additions done there, and we're studying all of these sites. And there's a number of other places where it's proposed or where there are moves to.
So these sites that have the sediment put down, that they're putting the sediment down not to specifically help the Saltmarsh sparrow, but perhaps for some other reason.
Yeah, a lot of the impetus is to help protect and maintain these marshes for everything that lives in the marsh, and for all of the other services that we get from marshes. I mean, marshes, as I say, they protect what's inland from them, and often that's people's houses.
Right.
And the marsh can slow down the movement of water. It can reduce the impact of that water on hurricane level storm surges or a really strong nor'easter. So often the reason for doing it is to have all these other benefits for people. Right. But increasingly people are recognizing that it could also benefit the sparrows and all the other things that live in the marshes. And so we're studying the way that we do this stuff to try to figure out how best to do it.
All right, so we're going to go to break now.
Okay.
It's about 2 minutes, I think. And when we come back, I have a few more questions about the deposition, the soil layering. So we're going to go to break now, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the soil in the marshes.
You know what, guys? There's a lot of tree branches and dry brush over here. We should probably move the bonfire over there.
I'm guessing Smokey liked that idea.
Oh, look, a redhead. Staring contest. You still got it.
I know.
Come alive with the forest.
The dad was cute.
They were looking right at us.
Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Okay, welcome back. We have our guest tonight is Professor Chris Elphick, and he's here talking about the Saltmarsh sparrow and the life and times of the Saltmarsh sparrow. So, Professor Elphick, we left off talking about soil deposition in the marshes, and you told us that the thickness or the depth of the deposition varies greatly. My concern, and I don't know anything about much at all, but my concern is if you raise up the level of the marsh, would that be an opportunity for Phragmites to come in and then do what Phragmites does in an awful way?
Yeah, so Phragmites is this an introduced plant that, again, from Europe, that can come in and completely take over marshes. So that's very much a concern. It's definitely something that people worry about. Phragmites tends to do tends to need relatively fresh conditions. So if the water's salty enough and the marsh is getting flooded frequently enough, then that can help prevent the spread of Phragmites. So we kind of have this balance. We want to raise the elevation enough that the birds can nest successfully, but we don't want to make it so high that it never gets flooded by salt water, because then Phragmites is likely to take over.
Very likely.
And so it's always this kind of balancing act. And so the amount of sediment that people add is often determined based on that balance. You know, if you have a marsh that is already very low, you can add quite a lot of sediment without that becoming a risk. If the marsh is just a little bit lower than where you want it to be, then you maybe would want to add less sediment.
There is an area in Old Saybrook, on the way out to the marinas under the bridge, and it is a huge expanse of what I assume is marsh, and it's all Phragmites. And I have to think, in that area is probably some would-be habitat for birds like the Saltmarsh sparrow, and they just can't catch a break.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that's certainly
Thank you for that succinct answer, sir.
Yeah, I mean, and so much of marsh management, marsh restoration in Connecticut and elsewhere for a long time was focused around Phragmites and trying to knock it back. And so actually, the tide gates is, if there's an existing tide gate, opening that up to let more salt water flow into the upper marsh is a way to control Phragmites.
Speaking of Phragmites, there is a marsh south of Universal Drive in North Haven, and it had historically been a Phragmites haven. And I don't remember now, but maybe 10 years ago, I don't live in North Haven anymore, but I have a friend there and I visit often. And they just came through and somehow just eradicated the Phragmites. But it wasn't the end-all solution, because after a few years, it started moving back. And now I think it's problematic once again. It's not like the Saltmarsh sparrow doesn't need a break,
Yeah, I mean, the trouble with Phragmites is that in some places there are permanent solutions. So if you can get salt water in regularly, that can be a permanent solution. And some of the rivers, like the Connecticut River, the Quinnipiac, which I think is probably the site you're talking about, there you can't change the fact that there's a lot of fresh water coming down the Connecticut River, and so you can't have that solution work. So people often use other solutions, which can, in some cases, the Phragmites will be burned or cut. In some cases, they spray with herbicide, and so in those situations along the big rivers, it's a very different and much harder problem, and it does require repeated.
I actually wrote to somebody at the DEP many, many years ago, and I said my suggestion was to get the convicts out there to start getting rid of the Phragmites, and they came back to me and they said, it's not that simple. The roots are rather deep, and it's not just cut it down and dig it up. It's a lot more difficult to get rid of it.
There is a reason that Phragmites is very successful. It just has biology that allows it to succeed in the world.
Now, I wonder, how does it work in the European? I mean, it doesn't have any food value for the deer, I would imagine. Is it a big problem in Europe?
No. So the irony is that big reed beds, as we would call them in Europe, Phragmites beds, are actually quite limiting in many parts of Western Europe. Certainly in England, where I grew up, there are relatively few left, and there are a number of endangered species associated with Phragmites in Western Europe. So over there, Phragmites
is a positive thing.
It's a good thing, and it's a thing that often people are trying pretty hard to conserve. Well,
they need to stay away from here, that's for sure. All right, so let's go. The last one in your report is forest conversion, or what other people call marsh migration. Tell me about that.
So the idea here is that the reason that marshes are in trouble is because they're getting encroached by the sea on one side.
Right.
And so if the marsh could migrate inland on the other side, it could just move inland with the rising tide.
Right.
So in theory, that makes sense. In practice, it undoubtedly happens at some level. We know that in geological time it happened. There were these marshes that we see today weren't there 10, 15,000 years ago when there was ice sitting on top of
Right,
New England.
Yep.
So we know that these marshes can move in and out. But the challenge today is that sea level rise is happening pretty quickly. And so the rate at which they can move needs to be pretty fast. And then, of course, we've also built all kinds of human infrastructure along the upland edge of the marshes, and people's houses, roads, and so on. And so that kind of puts a constraint on the upland edge. But there are lots of places where marshes could move inland, at least in theory. We don't really understand that process of how the upland converts into marsh. Many of the places where it could happen are currently forested. And so, one possibility would be to say, well, over time, this forest is going to convert to marsh. Maybe we can speed that process up. And maybe that involves cutting down some trees right at the edge of the marsh to facilitate that movement or that marsh migration.
So it doesn't sound like a very positive story for the Saltmarsh sparrow's long-term success, could we say?
No, it's a species that between the 1990s and the early 2010s declined by about 9% per year.
Wow.
So that means
that's quite a bit.
Well, the analogy I like to give is think about your stock portfolio declining at 9% per year for 20 or 30 years.
We'd be on the phone.
That would not be a good thing, right?
No, it would not be a good thing.
So it's about 3/4 of the world population probably disappeared over just a 25-year period. And so, that's the challenge that they face, and sea level rise is not going away.
No.
And so unless we act, unless we do something, this is a bird that we think will go extinct sometime in the middle of this century.
So quite possibly within my lifetime.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is an extremely sobering thought. Also, just here recently, and I don't know if it's from last year's report and they're just sending it out again, but the EPA just announced another 22 species that they are declaring extinct, including the ivory-billed woodpecker. And if you're a birder, you probably know that there's a debate going on about the ivory-billed woodpecker. I think probably more out of hope than out of anything realistic. But it just seems like extinction is just becoming a little bit too common of a word, and I haven't heard anything about that on the network news. Mm-hmm. And these animals are just slipping quietly away, and they're gone forever.
Yeah, I mean, so the bad news is that the magnitude of extinction that we predict will happen is on an order of what happened when we lost the dinosaurs.
Right.
It's, people talk about the sixth extinction, the idea being that we've had these 5 periods in geological time where there have been mass extinctions.
Right.
And what is projected to happen in the next couple of centuries is on that order of magnitude. The good news is that we're not there yet. We're just right at the very beginning. We're just starting to see that this will happen. And so we could do something about it, but if we just ignore it, then...
Well, my take on this is that the global community of humans is on this big, giant party train, and somewhere down the road, somewhere down the tracks, the bridge is out, and everybody's just partying and having a good time on the train, and a very small bunch of scientists are in the back saying, like you, we have to do something, we have to change, we have to stop this somehow, and nobody's listening. And we're careening down the tracks toward this the bridge out. And I think it's important to listen to scientists like yourself. And but unless you're a movie star or something, you're probably not going to get a lot of press.
There are certainly movie stars that get a lot more press than I do. I'll give you that.
I believe that's true.
Like nearly all of them.
Yeah. Okay. So this Saltmarsh sparrow study, is this ongoing, or is it complete, or is there another one going on?
Well, it's like I say, we've been thinking about and studying these birds since the early 2000s.
Right.
At this point, we're not really just studying saltmarsh sparrows. We're studying the entire ecosystem.
Right.
We're studying all of the birds that occur in these marshes. We're studying the plants and how the plant communities are changing. We're starting to study the invertebrates. Other people are studying fish populations, and there's lots of other people who are also studying these marshes. So the saltmarsh sparrow piece, because they're so close to extinction, is kind of, that's what people often focus on. That's the bit that gets at least a little bit of press.
Yeah.
But really, they're this symbol of what's happening to this entire system. And so the work that we're doing, the research that we're doing, although sparrows are still a part of it, it's much bigger, it's much broader. We're trying to understand how we keep marshes and how we keep marshes not just for the birds, but also for that storm surge protection, and also for the recreational opportunities and for the juvenile fish production that it provides that helps support fisheries and all of those different reasons.
Right.
We're also, with some colleagues at UConn, I have two really great colleagues at UConn who study the biogeochemistry of marshes and how marshes can both store carbon, which can help solving some of the problems we have with climate change, but also trying to understand how greenhouse gases are produced by marshes and taken up by marshes, to understand that balance so that we can figure out the role that marshes play in that. And I should say, I'm talking about this as though it's work that I do. It's work that I do as part of a big team. I've got both colleagues at UConn, other professors, but also a slew of really great graduate students and postdocs who are doing a lot of on-the-ground work, and then also colleagues up and down the East Coast who are working on these issues that allow us to study what's going on across the entire range of these birds, not just in single locations.
I would think, and I've never done a study like yours, but I would think it's probably really difficult studying a system that's constantly changing, if only just a little bit.
Yeah,
It's probably got some challenges there.
I mean, yes, but that's part of that's part of what makes it exciting and interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, and at times depressing, but that's part of what we're trying to understand. We want to know how it's changing, why it's changing,
Right.
and if there are things we can do to either reduce that rate of change or at least work with it and mitigate the bad effects.
Right. So one of my final questions is, what can the average citizen do, homeowner do, to help this process, or help you for that matter?
Yeah.
I mean, do you need people to go out and count birds, or what do you need?
On this project, we don't. I mean, you mentioned the Bird Atlas project, which was a different project that studied all of the birds in Connecticut.
Right.
We had incredible help from a lot of birders. So there are projects like that. This work is not really of that type, but certainly if birders are out and they see these birds, reporting them through eBird, which
Right.
is kind of an online way of crowdsourcing
Very
bird
important,
information,
yeah.
is very, very valuable. The types of things people can do, well, I mean, ultimately the problem is climate change. Ultimately, we're warming the planet. That's what's leading to sea level rise. So anything you can do to reduce your consumption of carbon is good, and we should be doing more of that, both
Right.
personally, but also when we can influence politicians. That's a good thing to do as well. And then there are other things. These marshes are also changing for other reasons. A big problem in this part of the world is the increased flow of nutrients into Long Island Sound,
yeah.
and that all goes through the marshes. And
Yep.
there's some parts of that it's hard to do anything about as an individual, but a lot of that nitrogen is originating with people fertilizing their lawns and doing things like that. So thinking twice about doing that, maybe not fertilizing your lawn or not doing it so often, can help reduce the flow of these chemicals into the watershed and into the marshes, because that's something that can help Phragmites, can increase the spread of Phragmites. It also contributes to the collapse of the marsh in some situations. So there are things that you can do at a very personal level as well.
Yeah, that's actually a recurring theme on this program, is to not use pesticides or fertilizer. But the uphill challenge there is that people and this is all marketing, people take a great deal of pride in having a perfectly green lawn. And I remember, what was it, the year before last, we had a big drought here. And my lawn was brown, and two of my neighbors' lawn were perfectly putting green quality. And you know, the sprinklers came, the irrigation system came on at 5 in the morning, and then at 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And it's going to be a tough sell.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the thing is to know that there's other ways to make your yard look great,
Yeah.
beautiful. And you know, I spent 6 years living in Reno, Nevada when I was in graduate school,
Oh, right, yeah.
and that was during a time where people were starting to realize that the amount of water that people were using for lawns just simply was not sustainable, and people were moving to xeriscaping and other ways of, you know, putting plants that grow without a lot of water or without a lot of pesticides
Yeah.
down, and there's ways to do it
And
that are just great.
I don't typically watch golf, but once in a while it'll be on, and there's like a desert classic or something, and in the background you see all the saguaro cactus and the scrub and this and that, the creosote plant, and then the golf course is brilliant green, and you know they got to be pouring tons of water in there. It's just, what a horrible waste of water.
Well, I don't play golf. I don't know a whole lot about
I
golf,
don't
but
either.
you know, it would be more of a challenge if you were playing it in the desert. It'd be much more like the original Scottish version, I think.
Yeah. Watch out for the rattlesnake. Oh my God. All right. So, so that's our show on the Saltmarsh sparrow. If you do a little research, it's kind of in trouble. As Professor said, it doesn't look good for the home team. But there are things that are potential helpfulness. One, I think, is the deposition of sedimentary layer. So I would just appreciate if, you know, somebody in our area decides we're going to throw sand on the marshes. Don't get all upset. There's probably a reason why they're doing it, and it might be to help seaside communities. It might be to help the Saltmarsh sparrow. As I said before to Professor Elphick, I think we as a community are getting a little bit too comfortable with the word extinction. And it's almost commonplace now. And the EPA just recently published a list of 22 birds, as I said, that 22 animals that are now considered extinct. And it didn't make the headlines. And these animals just quietly slipped away, gone forever. And it's rather alarming, actually. And I think we need to try to do what we can to eliminate future evictions, future extinctions. And so you can put a pollinator pathway in and not use pesticides. And I know I'm getting kind of soapboxy here, but you know, you're not going to hear this from network news. So I think it's important to have somebody say it. We have to stop using vast amounts of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, and of course fertilizer. And I pretty much think you're the only one who cares if you have a green lawn or not. And I might get a little flack for that, but that's enough for now. Anyways, so new to A Slice of Life, I have a email address dedicated to this show. I would ask that you give me some feedback, provide some insight, maybe some show suggestions. I would appreciate it if you were not rude or mean-spirited, and if you hopefully have something constructive to say, please feel free to chime in. It's the address is now at the bottom of the screen, and I would appreciate your feedback. And again, I don't need rude people chiming in saying rude things. So I'm looking for your feedback, I'm looking for show suggestions, and I think that's about it. So I think that's it for now. Professor Elphick, once again, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having
I
me.
applaud your work. I'm glad you and your colleagues are doing what you do. It's probably more valuable than we realize.
Well, I hope so.
That's it for tonight. Thank you for watching. Good night.